war debt to the United States. Nobody in France or Germany was paying that kind of money, but we were, because we borrowed this stuff and we had to repay it. So this is not new, this is part of the culture. Over the years, I do think that the United Kingdom made a major contribution to that relationship. We were there in Korea. We were not there, as Karen says, for Vietnam. We were there in Afghanistan and made a big difference. We were there in 2 Gulf Wars, the first one and then the invasion of Iraq. We have been helpful to the United States on a number of military occasions where they needed a plucky ally. They've not always been terribly helpful. They weren't very helpful at Suez, and they were at best kind of neutral, shall we say, over the issue of the right of the Falkland Islanders to have self-determination. And so, that's been complicated. We continue to provide a great deal, which is not just about the defense of Europe, despite some of the language that we're hearing from the current administration. Look at the facilities that the United States enjoys from UK bases, whether they are in Diego Garcia or Ascension Island, Falkland Islands or Cyprus or Oman. Around the world, there are things that we do, and indeed bases in the United Kingdom, which are fundamental to the North Atlantic security of the United States at a global level, not just about the protection of Europe. So I think we do provide quite a lot more than we sometimes give ourselves credit for. And I think the United States, which has made a huge difference to our security over the years, has always been transactional. Now, at the moment, is it still important to the United States, your question? I would say that it is. We've done all those things in the past. We remain important intelligence allies. We have a level of integration of our equipment, although I think we probably buy rather more from America than they do from us, and it may be that we need a defense industrial strategy for the future, given that we have an administration now which seems less committed to the defense of Europe than it was in the past. But as of now, we are very closely integrated. We need the Americans to make our nuclear deterrent system function, even though we've got our own warheads. And they need us for a number of other things. And the Five Eyes intelligence relationship, we are a significant player in that. So I think there's bags of substance to it, and I think that relationship is very important. The question, and then I'll stop, the question I think we have to ask is, to what extent is the United States, as now configured, as now managed, going to remain interested and committed to the defense of Europe, as opposed to the United States being part of a slightly different international order whereby it's the big guys, China, Russia, the United States, who get what they want, and the smaller countries have to, if you like to coin a phrase from Thucydides, suffer what they must. And I don't think we yet know the answer. I think the professional diplomats and military people in the United States are pretty clear about the relationship. I'm not so sure at the moment about the new political leadership.
Yes. Please. Sorry. Well, thank you very much for the invitation, Mr. Chairman. I don't want to repeat what my colleagues have said. I agree that there has obviously been a very important relationship between Britain, a special relationship with the United States. I confess that I don't always like the term, not because it isn't special, but because I think it's made us lazy on occasion. We can always hope that the Americans will bail us out. We have this sort of alibi mentality, I think, and means we don't have to look elsewhere, which I think is relevant to this morning's discussion, because I think we are going to have to look elsewhere. I absolutely endorse everything they've said about these close connections. I think the issue is not always about what has been going on in terms of our policy and whether our policies are congruent and close together and our aims are the same. It's been about our worldview. And what worries me about what is now happening is that the basis of the special relationship, so-called, has been about trust, and it is about shared values. And I think in the future, and your question is, we're trying to look forward, not backwards, can we expect that to continue? And I think it's much more difficult to be confident about that. It seems to me there's been a seismic change. I think Ukraine illustrates this very clearly. We have admired the Ukrainians and Zelensky for defending the values which we adhere to and which until very recently the Americans championed. Now it seems to me it's much less clear that that's the case. Peter was talking about the transactional nature. We seem to have a president who's willing to bully, cajole the Ukrainians into doing things that they don't think is in their interests. That's clearly not where Britain is. Indeed, the present government has stood out very clearly and I think quite rightly, in continued defence of Ukraine. So I think as Peter said, we've had differences in the past, but this doesn't feel to me like, let's say, Grenada, the differences over. This is a fundamental challenge to whether we still share the same values. And I think we have to work to stay as close as we can. Of course, this remains a critical relationship. Let's see where we can get with Trump. But let's kid ourselves. This is not the normal US administration. This is not a blip. This is a change. And I think we need to reinforce and look elsewhere. We need to think very closely about now what we do with Europe. And we need to think about our relationship with Canada, again picked off by Trump as some sort of proto-adversary. And probably with Australia. And we need to remain very clear and true to our own values. It's a very difficult line to tread. We know we will be under pressure from Trump to conform. But I think we should be very clear-sighted. This is not just another blip in the relationship. There's something fundamental going on here.
Chairman, could I add just a few comments to what my colleagues have said, with which I agree. The first thing, historically, it seems to me, this relationship, special, enduring, essential, whatever adjective we attach to it, it's of declining importance, I think, in world affairs. If you think about the power which Roosevelt and Churchill, between them and individually, could deploy, it's very, very different from the joint impact of the UK-US relationship today. And that's mainly because of the decline in relative power of the UK, arguably the United States as well. But I do think that's one of the things. It's been kept going and reinforced by working together in crises that my colleagues have talked about over the decades, joint projects, joint endeavours that we've both been involved in, and by some extraordinarily close political relationships, some of which have crossed the traditional political divide. So that's what's kept it going. But I think in the sweep of history, I think it's less important than and less should be placed on it than was the case in the past. The second, just to be explicit, and David Cameron, I think rightly was, this is an unequal relationship, and the asymmetry is baked into it, and it creates political problems, particularly on our side, because we are usually the demandeur for things to happen and for the United States to pay attention to the junior partner along the way. And my last point would be David's point, that the sort of relationship we've had, the one that mixes strategy with trade, with diplomacy, with the cultural interpenetration which we enjoy, that was based on being together in an alliance and a broad measure of agreement on our worldview, which is a power thing, and our values, which are very, very broadly based. And I think that is in question now, genuinely in question. America is changing. The American leadership plainly has changed. And that's what I guess your committee will want to disinter in one way or the other.
Thank you very much. Baroness Cousins.
Thank you. The special relationship, what it has been and how it might be changing, is usually considered from the perspective of government or institutions, whether intelligence or defence or cultural or whatever. But is there any evidence that you're aware of that American people, to what extent American people share or differ from the definition or the concept or the support for the special relationship and how it's changing?
The most recent years.
I think you're exactly right. This is what I was trying to convey. Because of the bedrock, not just of defence and intelligence, which, as you say, are government-to-government instruments, there's a perception, there's an attachment to tolerance, an attachment to liberalism in its broadest sense that I think runs through most of America. And common law and the particular view of freedom, as well as the English language, contribute to that. And if you went into an American classroom, or you look at the way the Americans do science, or you were cooperating with them on the F-35 says, some of those things would come out allowing for individuals. But I think it is true to say that the demographic in both our countries is changing. I don't think you'll any longer find people with an automatic connection to Europe and the UK in the same way that you would have done, say, 25 years ago. So I think one of the things it's incumbent on the embassy and the consulates to do is keep renewing those people-to-people ties in all their forms, and they're myriad. They don't always have to be done by government, but I think the diversity of both of our societies and that changing demographic is something we can put to the service of the relationship as a whole.
Thank you.
Lord Gregor.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. That's a very, very interesting kick-off to our inquiry. What I get from it, because it's taken all of you in broadly same territory, but quite a few words, that's not critical. You know, it's not a thing you can snappily give a definition to, is it, to a special relationship? I mean, and yet, somehow or other, in our inquiry, we need to have somewhere in our mind what it is that distinguishes our relationship with the United States from other friendly states. I've noted down 2 or 3 things that were said, all interesting, that it's a relationship of declining importance. It's one subject to maybe fundamental change. And Karen Pierce, I think you said it was unique. Most relationships are, aren't they? I suppose is what I'd partly say to that. But the follow-up question would be, can we get at it negatively by saying what is it that is fundamentally different between our relationship with the United States and our relationship with other friendly Western countries? If we find it difficult to have a positive description of it, what's the negative one, if you like?
Can I have one shot at that, which is to say I think a fundamental difference in our relationship with the United States from our other partners is that we depend on them for our defence. It is very difficult to imagine what we're going to do to defend ourselves if, for example, and this is very hypothetical, the Trump administration decides that it's going to end our nuclear cooperation deal, or if Trump moves out of NATO, or even becomes just so equivocal about NATO that the Article 5 guarantee is no longer plausible. I'm not saying those things will happen, and they were inconceivable until 6 weeks ago, I think. I think you now have to address them. Doesn't mean they will happen, but I think they're on the table. And I don't think we have a relationship with any other country that is absolutely fundamental to our defence. And that, I think, is changing, and we've got to start thinking about that. What would we do if we found that this post-war defence relationship that has been so vital to us becomes questionable? And I do think that makes this relationship unique. I stress, I'm not saying that is going to happen, but I think it is a completely different dimension of dependence.
I think the United States has its own type of special relationships with a whole bunch of countries. And with, some have been mentioned already, obviously the Western European countries, but also Japan, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Ireland. They've all got a version of a special relationship. And I think ours starts with what Karen was talking about right at the beginning. It's 2 countries which traditionally have had a broadly similar worldview based on power and the willingness to intervene internationally, with a high degree of intimate upstream foreign policy coordination, and a high degree of interoperability between our armed forces and our intelligence services. I mean, that's the first part of the UK-US relationship. And then the other 3 things I would mention, which I think which together create this sense of something unusual, is the scale of our trade and investment relationship, number 2. Number 3 would be this cultural ease that we have. When I was around in Washington, the opinion polls I remember would put Canada as the most popular country to Americans, and the United Kingdom would be second. So in terms of public opinion polling, that's roughly where we come out, and it would certainly validate the idea that there was something in popular esteem and affection, which validated the intergovernmental relationship. And my last point is about process. It's about the way this relationship is conducted. It seems to me that not unlike all other relationships, in the UK it's peculiarly conducted from the top. It's a relationship which does depend a lot on relationships between the Prime Minister and President of the day, between the White House and Number 10, and that is different pretty much from any other UK relationship with another country. I do think those things are different and together make up what we're trying to say is unusual. I too rather avoid the word special because I think it just carries too much baggage and is too much of a target.
Can I add just two very small points? I agree what the others have said. One is on the cultural ease that the others were talking about. I do think that's an important part of it. It does depend a bit who is the occupant of the Oval Office at any one time, but let's not forget also the asset that we have in the royal family, where I do think that the way in which the King now relates to other critical heads of state, Donald Trump is one of them, but President Macron is another. These are very important parts of the panoply, if you like, of what we, I suppose, have to call soft power, but it's part of what is special, the relationship, and that is unique. That doesn't exist between the United States and anybody else. And President Trump is not the first head of state in the United States who has been enamored of our royal family and has very much appreciated the attention that he has received from it. Second point, I would just say, back on the defense point, I do think that David is dead right to say that the defense relationship and the interoperability and so on that Nigel was mentioning are critical parts of it. But we must not forget that we're not in great shape, I don't think, on capabilities. Even 10 years ago, when I was the ambassador there, I had the defense secretary, I had the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, I had the president of the United States of America saying to me, you're not where you should be. You know, we relish the fact that the United Kingdom is a loyal, often unquestioning ally and has been there for us. But the capabilities of your UK defence, your armed forces, are not what we would like them to be. And I think in the 10 years since then, and George Robertson's report, which will come out soon, I suspect will lay bare how empty the cupboard is, if you like, is a real issue, and we should not be blind to that. We're going to have to raise our game, not just because it's about strengthening that relationship, but because Europe is going to have to do more to look after its own security in the future.
Lord Gokart, can I just add, just to quote what the Prime Minister said in the House last week about America being indispensable to us. And I think that is different from any other of our allies, important as they all are. It's very much in the UK's interests that America prevails as the major power in the world, because anything else fundamentally brings along closed societies and closed systems rather than open societies and open markets. And in the sense of, if you look at scale and right the way across the board, I would say we're America's closest ally, without wishing to attach a particular label. And I think if you think of America as indispensable and we as being incredibly close across the board, then that's what makes it different from any of our others.
Lord Horton.
If I can just do a follow-up, one of the things we're trying to conclude by the end of this is our start point in terms of how we sort of categorise elements of this special relationship and what sort of repair they're in. Would it be too simplistic to say that the relationship is sort of composed of two different parts? One is a sort of a shared subjective reality, which is about the history, the values, the royalty, and those sorts of things. And another part is shared objective reality, which is about measurables. It's about intelligence, it's about defence cooperation, it's about trade. And that in many ways, the shared subjective reality is in decline, and the shared objective reality is in a state of disrepair, which we need to pay attention to. Or is that too sort of premature distillation of what you've said so far?
I think it's a very helpful distillation. All distillations obviously are to some extent rather broad brush, but I think this ease of this cultural ease, this common heritage, this common history and so on is very important. But you know, you can't play your interests based on that. You can't further your interests solely based on that. I don't underestimate how important it is. And I think it's fascinating that people are still focused on whether the bust of Winston Churchill is in the Oval Office or not, you know. As though it's rather like in the old days when we used to see who was on Lenin's tomb, you know, are we up or are we down, for the Red Army Parade. But I think your point about what is objective, I mean, I think that's what we have to focus on, because whatever the sentiment has been, whatever this cultural ease, and I agree with my colleagues, but I think you'd find cultural ease differs enormously from one part of America to another. If you go to California, I defer to Karen, who's been there much more recently than me. But, you know, the Asia is what it's about. It's not about what's Britain doing, what's going on in Europe. Culturally, it may be in terms of tech and so on. But I think that the issue is exactly what you've said. I mean, objectively, and I absolutely agree with Peter, you know, we play our defence card, and goodness me, my lord, you know more about this than I do. We play our defence card as a real ace in Washington, and there's got to be something on the card. Mm. And I absolutely agree with Peter. We're going to discover that we talk a good game. I'm not quite sure what's behind the facade. So I think if we're going to be serious in continuing to have this position, which Karen quite rightly explained, where we are the go-to ally, you only go to that ally if you've got something to offer. And increasingly, we are really, really stretched. And you will remember, it's a long time since I was an ambassador in Washington, but we could certainly put a division in the field then. And we did all sorts of things that perhaps we weren't entirely enthusiastic about because the Americans asked us to during the Iraq War, because we had the capability. I think it's very doubtful we could do that today. You would know more than I do. But if that is the case, then this card is not the ace it once was in our hand. So I think thinking objectively about how we forward our interests, we must avoid pretending that we can either base it on the subjective division that you have pointed to, which is real, but at the same time we have got to bring something to this party, and we've got to be very confident that, you know, the American response is predictable, and we share the values, we share the objectives. And as I said at the beginning, I think that is an area that is now much harder to be confident about.
Well, James.
Thank you, Chairman. First of all, I think the job that the embassy does in Washington is absolutely wonderful. And I'm very much taken with David Manning's point about trust and values. And the trouble is that we can't subscribe to a lot of the values that are about to, 45 days in, there's not a lot of values stuff. That doesn't stop the relationship being unbelievably important in every way, but it's not any longer going to be as it was because they don't want it to be. I don't think they want it to be. I don't think they see a role for, and I think they despise Europe. Really, I think the Trump people despise Europe. And I agree with you, this sort of awful gussiness of whether or not there is a head of Churchill in the Oval Office and what that means for the special relationship is just simply rubbish. But it's fermented here. It's fermented here. So can I ask you, assuming, which I do, that things are going to go dreadfully wrong, we'll be left with no military card ready to play. We'll play such a card as we can, but it's tiny. The one thing, it seems to me, that we are still very, very, very good at is intelligence. Do you think, collectively, that the intelligence and security card, which is a powerful one, will survive the trauma of what is happening and what is going to happen?
Can I, if that is addressed to me initially, I don't want to dominate my colleague, but can I just say, on the defence point, slightly against myself, we still have real niche capabilities which are valued. I don't want to say that we're completely hollowed out and worthless, and I'm looking down the table at a real expert on this. He will know much better than I do. But you know, that we can seriously still bring niche capabilities. And when you look at America's other allies, we are still a serious player. It's about scale and scope and commitment, I think, and what we really mean to do. So I don't think we should get to the stage where we beat ourselves up so much that we don't think we have this card. I think we need to be very clear about what its face value is now. I think on intelligence, and I mean this is obviously a very sensitive area, it is going to be, in my view, more difficult to approach the whole question of intelligence sharing if you have a problem over this issue of trust. And how that will work itself out practically, I don't know, and that's for Richard Moore and others to talk to you about. But clearly, if you have some of Trump's appointees in these key jobs who have very strange track records and have said very strange things about NATO allies, the NATO alliance, and so on, and you have people in the administration who seem to be, let's say, looking for ways of appeasing Russia, then you have a problem on the intelligence front, because these are not the values that we have. It's not your parties, it's not the present government, it's not where we've been traditionally. And I think that is a big question mark against how the special relationship is sustained during the Trump administration.
Can I come in just on that? I think we help each other in a way that is unique, to be honest. Whether that's on the ground, whether it's in analysis, whether it's in simply sharing information, there's an interoperability that you don't find with any other ally.
Do you think that's going to last? I mean, the predilection is going to be to steer clear of what we can do.
I think the intelligence part of the relationship is so valuable that it will last, even if, as David was explaining, at the top level, there might be things we might wish to be a bit circumspect about. But the daily habits of cooperation between the agencies are extremely good, and on crime as well. And I think that will continue.
I agree with that, but I do think that it's both the nature of the people at the top of the US intelligence and security apparatus today, the ones chosen by the president. I think that may present some difficulties in terms of their view of us and their view of cooperation. I do think also that since our relationship has always been based on a high degree of professionalism, sense of commitment to respective services, that the hollowing out based on a narrow view of loyalty of some of these American services is going to place some strains on professional relationships bottom up. And I don't think any of us can say exactly how that will pan out, but this is going to be trickier to handle than probably at any previous time.
Yeah. Lord Alder does. Sorry, Peter, did you want to say something?
Very briefly, I think, just to complement, if you like, what Nigel was just saying, the professionals may well want to keep things going as they are and be absolutely committed and operate on the basis of the trust and the shared values and the interoperability that we know and love. But the problem is that from the top down, it's partly the hollowing out and it's partly the political directives that seem to be being applied to those institutions of the state which were, if you like, apolitical and professional, does seem to be changing the culture as well as the personnel. A lot of very good people are being thrown out simply because they do not pass the loyalty test. So that is likely to affect some things. But just to be a little less sort of gloomy about it, in the past we have sometimes had to manage the way in which intelligence is shared, even within the Five Eyes things. There are moments when, because of the risk of an inadvertent leak to a journalist or something, specific source information, for example, is held back for very good reasons. It doesn't in any sense invalidate the intelligence or the value of the sharing, but sometimes, even when you've got the most perfect working political relationship, you have had to do some work around source protection which was necessary. So you can carry on doing that, and it's by no means the end of the world.
Lord Alderdice.
Thanks very much, Lord Chairman. I'd like to focus a little bit further on these likely friction points that could make cooperation challenging as we move ahead. You've spoken about a number of things. Sir Nigel, you mentioned the fact that we had engaged in joint projects and that had been a very helpful thing in maintaining this relationship. But I'm wondering, for example, if we are moving to very different kind of focus, where this country might be looking, for example, to delicately cooperating on various fronts with China, whereas the United States administration might be looking much more at confrontation with China. We've also got other relationships which can produce challenges. Sir Peter will remember very well that the difference in the relationship between Ireland and the United States and Britain and the United States led to some interesting developments, which we were able to find our way through. But on things like China, and indeed maybe in the future Israel, we may find ourselves with a more challenging difficulty because of other relationships, not just our relationship. And on the defence question, which you flagged up as really being pretty bedrock now, the character of war is changing quite dramatically. And we're going to have to look at our own defence, but we may be looking at different places that need to be defended, perhaps much more focused on the home territory, and therefore should we be sending an aircraft carrier to the South China Sea to defend interests which may be not entirely aligned with ours? And indeed, if we look at what's happening in the Middle East, where we're finding ourselves responding to extremely cheap Houthi drones with extremely expensive Western missiles. That changing character of war might mean that a very different profile of our own defence materiel might be appropriate, and the Americans might not be looking at changing in the same kind of way. So I guess I'm really asking, on defence, on other relationships, on our own focus on international affairs, are there challenges and can they be overcome, or are they really in the future going to just diverge further?
I think to your first point about points of divergence, let's start with convergence, actually. I mean, I think there are areas, and goodness me, Karen will know better than me, where we can hope to work with the Trump administration. Indeed, we must. You know, we need to, I'm not going to say salvage, that's too loaded a word, but we need to maintain the relationship on the best state we can manage, despite the enormous uncertainties that now surround it. So I think that's a given. I think the Prime Minister's visit suggests that, you know, Trump is looking for some sort of sectoral deal. Maybe it's on AI, maybe it's on tech. And I think we should explore those sorts of openings. It's obviously vital we make the case that we shouldn't have tariffs slapped on us. And I mean, we'll get into some debate about, you know, the impact of Trump on the global economy. I think but to your point about points of friction, I think we have to be realistic. On a lot of policies, we don't necessarily have exactly the same view, and that it may be much worse than that. I mean, I think on, you mentioned the China issue. Now, on China, I would say there's a lot of common ground. Both in the United States, where it's a sort of bipartisan issue, more or less, and in this country, as I understand it, we accept that China is a disruptor, that it wants to change the status quo, certainly not in our interest, that its Marxist nationalist leader, Xi Jinping, certainly isn't a lover of democracy, and we need to be clear-eyed about that. I think for us, though, the issue is, what do you do about this? And the previous government, as I understand it, and the current government have a view that you cooperate where you can. China's there. It's 1.3 billion people. It's vital to the international global community, and not least economically, in a way that, you know, in the old days in the Cold War, we could pretend that the Soviet economy wasn't there. You can't do that with the Chinese economy. So I think our view is you have to cooperate where you can with your eyes open, but you also have to contest and confront where you think you must. Where does that line come? And it may not be in the same place as where the Trump people want to draw it. And I think that is going to be something that will be a source of constant negotiation for us. We won't necessarily see eye to eye on things like electric vehicles, or whether we're going to speak out on Chinese performance on human rights, or whatever it may be. And as far as I can see, the Trump administration not much exercised about global human rights. We are going to be. So how you draw this line of distinction is difficult. But But I would also say that I think we need to be aware that if we don't toe the line, we may come under pressure. And we'll have to manage. This isn't a China-specific problem. You know, if we do things that the Trump administration don't like, and we're not going to be unique in this, what will be the reaction in Washington? This is something that is very difficult to calculate. Would it be private? Will it be in public? Will we get a dressing down on TV? We don't know. So I think that, you know, every government has to worry about that. But I would also say that I think we've got to be very careful not to be caught flat-footed, because my own guess, and it is entirely a guess, is that Trump longs to do a great big deal with China. And so, you know, if we have been busy towing the line, doing all sorts of things that are actually quite difficult for our economy, and this applies, I think, also to our European partners, and then Trump suddenly comes with a piece of paper saying, well, I've done this massive deal, we could find ourselves scrambling to catch up. So I think my own view is we need to have a China policy that is about Britain. It's in our interest. Of course we have to adjust to the realities of working with our partners. But I think we should resist assuming that we can, it will be easy necessarily to draw the line in the same place. On other points of contention, I mustn't go on, but you know, you've mentioned Palestine. There's climate change. There's the whole question of support for multilateral organizations. There are big differences of philosophy and view, and these come back to values, in my view, and it's no good pretending that our policies and Trump's policies are going to converge on a lot of those things.
I'd say the opposite in a sense. I mean, I think that it's difficult to find either a sort of conceptual area in international relations or a particular geographical area where our interests are really converging at the moment. I mean, it's more divergence than convergence. The President McKinley worldview of land grabs, and I think Peter mentioned Thucydides earlier, you know, might is right, and all that. That isn't our view. It won't be our view, I think, whatever government we have here, given that we are a middle power that uses international institutions for our own advancement as well as because that is morally right. So I think at the macro level, there's a huge divergence. And more or less any big foreign policy issue that we're dealing with today, we don't agree with the United States and have more alignment with our European partners. So whether that is the Middle East, whether it's Iran, whether it's climate change, China, but above all on Europe itself. The difference with this administration, you know, is this antipathy towards Europe, towards the European Union. We are held in the balance somewhat, but we're not tarnished in quite the same way in their eyes. But that is, I think, is a new factor and a malign one, which I hope will not deflect our government from the path it's set for a reset with the European Union, which is important strategically, but also in the economic basket. And I know, Chairman, you probably want to come on to that a bit later on. But that seems to me the area where we, if anything, need to be most rigorous in defense of what's in our long-term interests and not be swayed too much by the Vance, Musk, Trumpian view of Europe, which is extremely one-sided.
Well, Derek, do you want to?
Just on this this issue of likely future differences between this U.S. administration and ourselves, just wanted to drill down to two of them. On China, I mean, in the first term, I think there was a trade war lasting 2 years, Trump's first term, which involved some $500 billion worth of tariffs. And we're already into a tariff war in the second term. How likely do you think it is that we are going to be asked, the UK is going to be asked, Europe is going to be asked at some point in the next 4 years to take specific measures in our own economic, commercial relations or even political relations with China that back up whatever the new administration is trying to achieve there? How difficult is that going to likely be for us? What sort of decisions might be asked of us, if you're prepared to speculate a bit about this? And if you look at another clear, likely area of dispute, which is the Middle East, if this administration's policy on Gaza and on the Palestinian issue stays where it is, I mean, there is a fundamental divergence here isn't there? And as we approach questions, if the ceasefire holds and we get to a place where the question is about Gaza's future, about who runs the administration of Gaza, about how reconstruction is done, isn't there going to be a huge gulf between us in Europe and the US administration on how all that works out? And I don't know how much you're willing to speculate on this. What would be your advice if you were advising the Prime Minister on how he should navigate these issues and handle this US administration on them to avoid us then getting hit with measures ourselves? Because what you've seen from, for example, those brief tariffs threatened against Colombia, is tariffs are a multi-use weapon for this administration. They're not just about trade issues, but they can be used if you take a divergent, unhelpful policy on almost anything. So there are risks down, real risks down here for the line, not just a political disagreement about the way forward.
Shall I try? Well, thank you, both of you, for that. I don't quite start where Nigel starts. I don't think there are a huge number of disagreements between us and the Trump administration across the board, but I'd also make the point that it's very rare in the relationship that a point of disagreement disrupts the whole relationship. The last time I can think of that happening was with Bosnia, actually in 1992, when America had a very anti-European attitude to what we in the French were trying to do. Now, we'll have to see how Ukraine plays out, but the Prime Minister's made it very clear that we will work with President Trump. We will put our ideas to allies, including President Trump, and he shares President Trump's desire to have a lasting peace deal. I think when you look at something like the South China Seas or the Houthis, we are upholding, under UK national interest, we're upholding our belief in freedom of navigation. And I think that also answers one of the earlier points about other allies. We do see it as the UK and the successive governments as part of our role in the world to uphold international and national goods, and freedom of navigation would be one of them. On Kim's question on tariffs, Americans have traditionally, going back to the Civil War, had a very different view of how you use tariffs from the way we would view that. They are indeed an instrument of policy. They're an instrument of incentives, compulsion. They're not just there to restore a difference in a trade deficit, and we obviously do not believe in that way of using tariffs. But the Prime Minister's also been very clear, including to Parliament, that we won't choose. We don't think we have to choose between the EU and the US, and therefore, by extension, what that means for China policy. He and the government will pick a way forward that is most in the UK's interest for those given circumstances. So I don't think there's a blanket answer to that. We will have to weigh at the point at which we might get a US request, whether it's in our interest to accede to it or not, looking right the way across all the equities that might be involved in that, and the answer might well turn out to be different in each case. So I don't think it's possible to lay down the template for how we might handle that. On Gaza and the Middle East, I agree there are some points of divergence there. I remember the first Trump administration, as you do, where we had the Kushner plan for the Middle East. But the important thing that the then British government wanted to do was to try and see if that plan could be used to find a way forward. So again, I don't think it's a question of rejecting or accepting something. It's that this is the start of a conversation, a discussion that will have to bring in a huge number of countries, including, importantly, Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and let's start having that conversation. Let's use what openings we can to try and find a way forward. So it's pragmatic.
Could I pick up the Middle East? Oh, sorry, Peter.
Sorry, yeah. Peter. Just, thank you very much. A couple of points. The others, of course, are right that we have to be realistic about the extent to which there will be continuing divergences. There always were, there always will be. Some of them you can manage relatively easily. Karen talked about Bosnia. I remember not much long After that, in the 1990s, we had squabbles over Northern Ireland, and Lord Alderdice recalls that, and we were both in the middle of that, and we got through it. I think the single most important strategic divergence that we're going to have to deal with is the management of the relationship with Russia. Now, we have done very good work, and I'll come back to that in just a second, in, if you like, trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, and there is good language coming out of the State of the Union speech last night, and there's the letter from President Zelensky, and there's a chance of that relationship being put back together. But fundamentally, the way in which the Trump administration has positioned itself is a much more pro-Russian one than the rest of us would have gone along with. When you've got The Economist, the Financial Times, and a number of other serious organs saying America has given up on Europe and is siding with Russia, that's pretty alarming. We haven't had that for decades, and we have to deal with that current reality. And that, I think, is the biggest strategic problem. Even if we are now back in the business of trying to find a way forward with a combination of a ceasefire plan and security guarantees that Ukraine needs, we still got that fundamental problem of a very different approach to dealing with Russia. Is that part of a grand strategy to split off Russia from China, or, as Karen was suggesting, the Americans deciding that the three big beasts in the jungle, China, Russia, and America, divide up the world between them, and the rest of us can go hang? Perhaps, I don't know. I don't know whether there's that degree of strategic thinking, but we need to be thinking in those terms about those big issues. A couple of other tiny things. On tariffs, we're going to be doing some nimble work. Lord Mandelson will be doing some work on this. He knows a lot about trade policy. I think the only thing I would add is that for Donald Trump, not only are tariffs the most beautiful word in the English language, it is also, as I understand it, and the others may correct me if I'm wrong, it is a means of not putting up taxes when the existing tax cuts come to an end later this year. He's going to have to find some additional revenue. And for Trump, in many ways, tariffs equals income, federal income, alternative to tax rises, which would be very bad for the base and for people who voted for him. So he's going to be with tariffs, whether we like it or not. Whether we can ourselves negotiate a better deal because our trade is more or less in balance, that's to be seen. But the concept, I think, is there, and it's not going to go away, and that's what I'm hearing from a number of people who are close to the president on that issue. On the Middle East, the others have said the key points. I would just add one other four-letter word, Iran, which is that there is talk that once the whole Ukraine issue is resolved, let's hope it is, and the slaughter stops, and once whatever the Israel-Gaza package, Hezbollah, Hamas becomes, that maybe Donald Trump, squeamish though he can be about starting wars and seeing people killing on the battlefield, might be persuaded by a number of his donor friends and possibly even by the Israeli government that a weakened Iran is an Iran that it's worth giving one more push to see if you can deliver something resembling regime change. My own view is that regime change does not come from external military pressure. That tends to consolidate the hold on power of an internal regime. But let us not forget that Iran is a possible future foreign policy issue where we might not see eye to eye.
Chairman, if I may, I'd like to come back to Lord Darrick's question on the Middle East and have a shot at responding to that, because I think it is a very profound problem for us. I think our philosophy about how to handle the Israel-Arab problem is basically different. And for Trump in the last administration, goodness me, you know this better than I do, you were there, working to resolve the crisis from the outside in is more or less what they did with the Abrahamic Accords. And I applaud that. It's obviously very important that Israel should improve its relationships in the region and feel it can live at peace with its neighbors. But the core issue, for me anyway, is Israel-Palestine. And I think it's very difficult to imagine a settled solution in the Middle East without finding some way of providing for sovereignty and independence of some kind for the Palestinians. Now, if we are able, as the British government, to encourage Trump to keep pushing the Israelis to return to the table with the Palestinians, and there have been hints of that, and it seems to me objectively we have an ally in Saudi Arabia on that, then I think, maybe, just maybe, we can find common ground on this whole issue. But I think it would be foolish to pretend that we have seen this crisis in the same way as the US administration does. For us, I don't think, and I think back to the previous British governments that we've all worked for. I think for them it is absolutely essential that there is an Israel-Palestine solution, and this isn't something you can tack on to a regional plan. If I could just say a word about Ukraine, I think, as my colleagues have said, I applaud what the British Prime Minister has been doing, what we've been trying to do, and anything we can do to get the Ukrainians and the Americans back round the table and some forward movement to some sort of acceptable solution is absolutely desirable. I would just make the point that there's absolutely no sign that Putin is interested in this peace deal. And I would also say, a ceasefire is not a peace deal. And we need to be very clear about this. I mean, at the moment, Putin is sitting there, and as I understand it, the Americans have said, well, they certainly can't join NATO. You can keep the occupied territories. We're going to divide up their minerals between us. And that's before this negotiation has begun. What more does Putin need to do to encourage? We don't know. And I think it's also worth saying that the Ukrainians have agency in this. At the moment we're addressing this, at least a lot of people are addressing this crisis as though the only people who count are the Russians and the Americans. Actually, the Europeans do have a role in this. We have a great many of Russia's frozen assets in European capitals. And the Ukrainians have fought for 3 years for their independence. And I would personally, it's a long time since I served in the then Soviet Union, but I'd be quite surprised if they're just willing to say after 3 years, well, we've been fighting like this, but Trump's told us to give up. And so I think there's a long way to go in this, and I think the difference of our approach on Ukraine and Trump being in a hurry and wanting to do a deal, I think there's a very fundamental difference of approach. And I think we may find it, despite the Prime Minister's best efforts, very difficult to hold together over what happens to Ukraine.
Ms. Morris.
Well, thank you very much. David, you mostly answered my question. Could I just probe a little bit more on the relationship that we have with Saudi Arabia and the relationship between the US and Saudi? Do you think, on Monday, the Arab leaders met in Cairo to put forward a plan for Gaza. Today it's been rejected by the US. Do you think there is a place for dusting down the Arab peace initiative, probably with Saudi Arabia taking the lead, which has offered peace with Israel over all these years? Do you think that there is a place, and could we play a part in that?
Well, my answer comes with an immediate health warning. I'm certainly not an expert on Saudi Arabia. And indeed, I think if you want to get into this, you need to ask colleagues of mine who are much better qualified. I'm sure there has to be a place for the Arabs in the solution in the region. I've no doubt about that. And I think it's interesting that they have rejected Trump's suggestion of taking over Gaza and turning it into some kind of massive real estate project. And they've come up with what seems to me a plan that is seriously lacking in detail, but they've come up with a plan about what to do for Gaza. But I don't believe it makes sense to try and impose from outside a solution on the region. And I think it's very important that Saudi Arabia is a key player in this, because they have the heft, they've got the money, they are the dominant regional power. And I'm sure that they should have a vital voice in it. So my own view is that by all means keep the Western powers involved, and it's inconceivable there can be a deal without the United States, but I also think it can't last any more than a deal imposed on Ukraine can last. You have to have the people who are involved with you, who are going to subscribe to it.
Oh, please.
Thank you very much. One comment from Karen. You said that we have a common law, common, but there is a difference, because they politically appoint and elect their judges, and we now have executive orders just setting law aside. So that's a very big divergence. You also said we are America's go-to ally, and that's a value. But why should we be their go-to ally if they're not going to defend us in Europe? That becomes a really fundamental question, that we're deploying people, aircraft carriers, for American interests, and they're not prepared to back us up in Europe. And within that context, we're trying to reset our relationships both with the European Union and bilaterally and multilaterally with our European neighbours. And I think the Prime Minister is doing a strenuous job on that. But what we're being told is that the EU was only set up in order to screw America, that frankly he's not really interested in what happens to Europe. And it raises the issue of how we can ride between our interest in Europe and maintaining this relationship. I'm not saying we shouldn't try. I think we should, and I think you've all given us indications of how we should and why we should. But it seems to me there comes a crunch point where there might be a fundamental choice between US and Europe. Is that something you think is a fearful possibility?
Can I just say?
Yeah, do please go ahead.
I think the Prime Minister is very clear that we're not going to choose between our allies. Both are very valuable to us. But I also think if you listen to President Trump's press conference with the Prime Minister, he did stick by Article 5. It is a congressional decision put there by Marco Rubio, Secretary Rubio, that America cannot leave NATO without congressional agreement. And although there is, you're quite right, there is a difference of view in the Trump administration from many of its predecessors about Europe, they do help us. They will help us. We're in the South China Seas for our interests, not just America's. And they have assisted us. They still have troops in the Balkans, for example. So it's a much more symbiotic relationship, I think, than you were implying. I turn to Nigel.
I was going to go on just to talk more generally about the tension, Lord Bruce, that you were talking about between the United States and Europe, a familiar tension. I think the Prime Minister is right to try to hang on to what we can of the relationship with the US and their commitment to European security. As we've seen in the last few days, that's going to be tough, but I think it's the right objective, and on trade and trade as well. But I do think in terms of what's going to change, we've been left since Brexit, we the UK, more exposed to the United States. And the US has been going through a difficult period with Trump 1 and the pressures on the Biden administration in the foreign policy area. That affects the UK probably more than anybody, because we are so closely connected to the way that the US conducts its foreign policy. So I think, in a way, strategically, the most important thing for us, as well as maintaining what we can of the UK-US relationship, is moving ahead with Keir Starmer's initiative with Europe. And that has at least two fundamental elements to it. The first is the security, defence, foreign policy element that we've been talking about this morning, caused by this new world order that confronts us and a diminished, at least, American support for NATO and for Europe. But the second is obviously the review of the trade and cooperation agreement that we negotiated 5 years ago, the defects of which are apparent in British public opinion and need over time to be corrected. I think that if we are able, and there's an EU summit in May for the UK, if we are able to create a much closer relationship between the UK and Europe on defence, for all the difficulties of that, which go back a long time, including some real-life efforts in areas of defence procurement and kit. If that is possible, it ought to be not only acceptable but supported by the United States, because it goes in the direction that they're asking us to go. Whether it does without an unpleasant interview here or comment there is we'll have to see. But I think it ought to be saleable to them. The second is much more difficult, because in Trump's first term, he was encouraging the UK government of the day to go for complete rupture with the Europeans, and that's obviously the mood today. So that will, I think, take some explaining to the United States, but this is an area where our government will have to be firm, and this to me is not should not be up for negotiation. We're going to have to do that if we're going to rebalance our own long-term security interests and respond to a world which requires us and other Europeans to act much more confidently on our own.
Ernest Fraser.
Thank you. Obviously, the challenge for us is to sort of unpick what's happening in the here and now and try and identify some long-term trends. So I want to come back to the international and multilateral organisations in this new world order. You know, one would think that they might provide some sort of ballast in our relationship with the US, although I don't think any of us could have imagined the US voting with Russia and North Korea at the UN a few weeks ago. But how much is our membership of these organisations, and you know, whether it's the UN, NATO, Five Eyes, AUKUS, how important is that to our ongoing future relationship with the US? and just as a sort of subsidiary question to that, I think, Karen, you touched on the attitude of the younger generation, and you mentioned, you know, the 17-year-old graduates at West Point. Our research seems to say that there is a sort of generational shift going on in domestic American public opinion around their attitude to how important not only the UK, but actually how important America should concentrate overseas is becoming. So I just wondered if you could comment on those two shifts, if you like.
I've served at the UN, as you know, as well as in Washington. We don't always have the same interests in the multilateral organisations, but more often than not, even with the Trump administration, we do, and we work through that. I'm afraid it won't just be on the Ukraine resolution in the General Assembly. I suspect some of the differences will start to show on some of the more social policy resolutions that will come with the Commission on the Status of Women, for example. And we will have to work through those as we did before. We add in the international multilateral dimension to all aspects of government dealings with the Americans, whether the Americans are members of X or not. So, for example, President Trump wishes to pull out of WHO, we would still discuss world health issues, pandemic issues with the United States, and we would discuss how, if you like, the international system is doing anyway. So it's an important part of the conversation that particularly the Foreign Secretary has with his counterparts, but obviously it's not the only aspect. Something like CPTPP, where we are members and they are not, but Canada is a member, Mexico is a member, that's a very interesting contribution to any debate about prosperity in the Pacific area. So again, it forms part of the regular discussions that the Foreign Secretary would have. On the younger generation, there's some really fascinating polling that I can't remember all of, but we could easily send you, the embassy could send you. It depends which questions you ask. On the whole, Britain comes out either top or near the top, as Nigel and Peter were saying. Australia comes out pretty high. But some of that is very much around Australian cultural things like surfing. So it does depend a little bit on what question you're asking. But certainly if you go round the US and visit institutions, whether they're state level, whether they're city halls, there is enormous interest and affection for the UK. And a kind of understanding that we are cousins, if you like, and that we start from the same place, even though we don't always agree.
Can I say a word about your question on multilateralism? Because I think there is a philosophical difference, probably. I think for us, as a medium-sized power, we believe that it's very important that there's a rules-based international order which is policed, if you like, or at least there is a framework provided by multilateral institutions which we all belong to, and we observe the rules. I don't think that is the same view in Washington. And I defer to Karen on this, but I think it probably, you can point also to some extent, this is true of the Democratic Party now as well as the Republican Party. But my view is that this administration, in the person of Trump, will see multilateralism in a completely transactional way. And unless it's useful, it gets in the way. And you would rather deploy American power on a one-to-one basis than have to go through the bureaucratic procedures and the voting procedures of being in an institution, that is an inhibition to your exercise of power. So I think there is a fundamental difference. It's partly about our size. It's also, I think, partly about values and attitude to international relations. It was quite clearly, performance politics to pull out of the Paris Climate Change Agreement on day one, to walk out of WHO, which Trump has accused of misleading everybody on COVID, and so on. And you point to this extraordinary, absolutely unprecedented vote in the UN. And even if it's gesture politics on one level and it's showmanship, it comes back to this question of trust, and can you work with people who are going to, subject you to this kind of shock? I think multilateralism is very important for us. I think, again, it's an issue we need to be absolutely clear. We're committed to it. I also think it could easily backfire on the Americans if they take it too far. Multilateralism isn't going to go away. There may be a vacuum because the Americans leave. It may be filled by the Chinese. And other Western countries will suffer for that, because we will have, without the American voice in place in key institutions, whether it's climate change or whatever it is, we are weakened, in my view. So I'm not sure that it will in the long run help the United States very much if they do that. But I think to your point, I think we need to be clear that we do not see multilateralism in the same way.
Thanks. Just a couple of general points. One is that I think we have to be ready for the reality that whether it's in the international organizations or whether it's in terms of our own determination to reset relations with Europe while fixing relations with America or keeping them in good repair, there will be some nasty surprises. We often will not be consulted very closely, even after the very close consultation between President Trump and the Prime Minister. We didn't know, the British government was not tipped off that he was about to suspend all military assistance to Ukraine immediately afterwards. I don't think we knew that they were going to vote as they did. I'd be fascinated to know how it actually happened at the United Nations General Assembly on that ludicrous resolution which declined to apportion blame for the Ukraine war to the Russians for having invaded. It will be like that. It was always a bit thus. Sometimes the process of consultation in the US system was for them to whir the cogs and work out what they wanted and then call up the allies and saying, here's what we're doing, are you with us? Rather than consult at an earlier stage of the policy-making process. I think we made a lot of progress in recent years. Maybe at the moment we're going a little bit backwards, but we're going to have to live with that. And in a sense, Lord Darrick's question, how do you advise the Prime Minister to deal with all this stuff? I think it's about not so much challenge and confront, which we may need to do sometimes with the Chinese, but nudging and adjusting in a different direction. That may be part of the answer on tariffs. I think it certainly needs to be the answer on the commitment that this government is making, quite rightly, on Europe. The reality is, if we can project what we need to do with fixing relations and interests in Europe in the context of what's good for America as well. In other words, they want the European Union to have economic growth and to do more in terms of shouldering the burden for NATO. Well, we need to have economic growth and closer relations with European neighbours for that to work. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to meet an objective, stated objective, of the United States government. So phrasing stuff in the context of what matters to them and persuading them, if you can, this is back to the point about personal relationships, to adjust their fire in the light of new facts which they might not have thought about, will be a part of this. So lots of hard work to be done there. There will be bumpy surprises, and sometimes there will be stuff that's chucked out stream of consciousness which 2 days later doesn't actually turn out to be American policy. We shouldn't take every single utterance as being ex cathedra, but we do need to face up to the fact that it's going to be different, and to the extent we can, try to nudge and adjust where they are in a different direction to take account of what we think is in our interest in the context of what's in their interest too.
Ms. Crawley.
Thank you, Chair. in our earlier discussion on looking at the non-definition of the special relationship, I think David Manning raised one of the ingredients of that relationship as our relationship as far as nuclear weaponry is concerned. And perhaps we could delve a little deeper into that. We have an enormously close relationship with the US. They produce, they service the Trident missiles. We supply the warheads. And do you think, looking ahead, that that is going to remain the case in President Trump's efforts to decouple from Europe?
I see no reason at the moment to panic on this. I raised it because I think it would be, wrong not to put this on the table. This is a key part of the special relationship. And if we're worried about what is its future direction and contours, it is an absolutely integral part. And the nuclear relationship, of course, it includes all sorts of aspects. It's not just Trident. But the fact is that it is absolutely vital to us, and we have to think about, what is that going to look like under President Trump? I mean, you can make the case that actually it's very convenient for the Americans because it's very useful for them. I mean, this is if we get into this argument about leverage, it's leverage, So why would you put this at risk? But I think in thinking about our defence posture, and I very much agree with Nigel and I think with Peter, who've spoken about the need to think hard about the European relationship, and to make the case that we need to develop that. We need to do that in parallel. Logically, that ought to be welcome in Washington. I think there is a question mark in my mind about how cooperating with Europe goes down with Trump and his entourage at all. I can't speak about Trump, but we've had it, J.D. Vance coming to Europe. We had Musk interfering in our internal politics. We know that there is much greater, let me put it like this, MAGA sympathy for the populists in Europe than there is for the moderates. And so calculating what the attitude to us, moving closer to Europe on defence or economically, and I'm sure Nigel's right, we need to do both, I think that's quite a difficult thing to get right. On the other hand, I don't see any signs at the moment that President Trump is threatening us over this, or that there's any inclination in the United States to call into doubt the nuclear agreement. But I think it would be wrong for you, if I dare say this to your committee, not at least to be thinking about if this relationship of trust and common view is in jeopardy, what might that mean?
Could I add a fact? The Mutual Defence Agreement is the 1958 original nuclear agreement, and it's renewed every so often. We have just renewed it, and we have renewed it indefinitely rather than on a 10-year cycle. So I think that's a piece of good news. I think as well the investment that is going in Britain and Australia to the AUKUS submarine development, matched of course by America, that also is a positive factor for the future.
Karen, was it renewed under Biden or Trump?
It was renewed under Biden, but the Trump camp, for want of a better word at the time, were informed about it.
Ernest Blackstone.
First of all, I'm terribly sorry I was late for the ridiculous reason that I've lost my phone. Anyway, that means I missed what you said at the beginning about the special relationship. But I just want to be slightly provocative about the way in which this debate has gone up until now. Because it seems to me that all of you, perhaps to slightly different degrees, are very, very committed to keeping the relationship with the United States pretty well as it is. And I wonder whether that can possibly happen whilst this divergence is so great and is likely to become greater, which I think is one of what two of you have said. And this brings then the issues of trust and values, which Lord Soames mentioned earlier. And I think there are three categories that will need to be taken into account in this context. The first is Parliament, And I think there's already a lot of restiveness amongst members of Parliament, particularly on the Labour side, about what is happening in the United States under President Trump. And that restiveness will continue if they perceive there's not enough toughness from their leader, our Prime Minister, in dealing with this response. And the second is the electorate, where we know from public opinion that there's a tremendous amount of sympathy with Ukraine, a lot of sympathy with the Palestinians, especially amongst young people, and this all affects their perception of the United States as well. But thirdly, our allies. The US is not our only ally. I've got a special interest in, or have had, because I used to be the chairman of the Franco-British Council, and we cannot at any point dismiss the importance of the French to us. They are our nearest neighbours, and they have been our allies and close allies for a very long time. The rest of the European Union, the Germans, and so on, are also equally important. We mustn't forget Canada. Canada is under enormous threat at the moment, and I think they would expect the UK to take up their cause with the Americans, and very forcibly and publicly. We haven't yet really seen that. I also believe that there is a lot of scope, as more than one of you suggested, for a much closer relationship with the European Union on defence. We already have quite a close one with the French, and this is likely to grow. If that is the case, surely that can be seen in part as a move away from such dependence on the Americans on the defence and security front. And nothing is forever in this world. And if we're going to see this huge movement in terms of where the Americans stand on so many international issues, whether it's multilateralism, whether it's aid for developing countries, whether it's Russia, and I was going to raise Russia, and I'm extremely glad you did, because we've got a completely new position now from the United States on Russia, and it's not one that we hold, nor do any of our allies. So I want to ask whether you can't see a point where the conventional wisdom about this special relationship is really deeply threatened, and we should be talking about not only a reset with Europe, but a reset with the United States.
Well, I agree with that. I mean, I don't think the reset, I think a reset is going on, and I think the profundity of the challenge and what we've heard over the last few weeks has genuinely sunk in the UK, elsewhere in Europe, and so on. I don't think that that's in doubt. In terms of what it means, the incoming German Chancellor, just after the election, used the word independence from America. And I'm not sure that works either as the end state, and certainly not as the transitional state that we're in, or would work for the UK. Not complete independence. I think giving ourselves more options, trying to keep the best of the UK-US and transatlantic relationship, while at the same time finding other partnerships, particularly in Europe, who are still 50% of our trade and already have a lot of security and defence links. That, to me, is what we need to be aiming for. I also agree with you that foreign policy is the result of an often intangible sense of feeling in public opinion. And public opinion at different stages has had a negative opinion of developments in the US, of cultural change and differences between us. And that's very, very profound for obvious reasons today. And you've already seen in British public opinion polls a reduction of support and interest and liking for the United States, the same across Europe. That must affect the political environment in which ministers are going to operate if they want to have very, very close, sometimes risky, operational projects with the United States. There's nothing they can do about that unless there were a fundamental change of heart on the Trump side, which doesn't look very likely at the moment. But I agree with your fundamental point. I think we are at a turning point. But I think whether it's talking about a peacekeeping operation in Ukraine or about the nature of European security in a transitional 5 to 10 year phase, we're still going to need a lot of American involvement and support.
we're approaching... Sorry, please go.
A brief word. I mean, just to say, we did talk a bit about Baroness Bex and some of those things that you mentioned. I don't think we were really saying keep the relationship as it is. I think what we were trying to say is that there are a number of ways in which we're going to have to face up to new realities, and we've got to learn to be a bit more transactional, rather in the way that the Trump administration is, and be pretty hard-headed about where our own interests lie. And I talked a bit about the threat posed to our security by the cozying up to Russia, and handing, if you like, Putin a number of negotiating points in advance of a negotiation even beginning over the heads of the Ukrainians. We had that in Afghanistan, and look how that ended. The Trump administration negotiated with the Taliban over the heads of the Afghan government, and it ended up with the mess that we've got now, even though he managed to try to blame Biden for it. So I think we're trying to understand the new realities, and I don't think we would saying keep it as it is. But we need to be transactional too, pragmatic, and at the moment, whether you're trying to deal with the security threats to Europe posed by the Russian invasion of Ukraine or whatever, America is an indispensable partner, to take the phrase that the Prime Minister has used. And it seemed to me that there was pretty widespread support for the way in which the Prime Minister was playing a kind of British role, not so much bridging, but if you like, trying to fix a problem that had broken out between different friends and partners and allies. And I think that is partly what the British public would like us to do, almost regardless of who is in power. And that is a role that we can play because of the fact that we are European and we're also a very close ally of the United States. So I don't think we're doing this starry-eyed because we want to hang on to nanny as if nothing has changed. We know that a lot has changed. And I couldn't agree with you more about what you say about engaging with our European partners. But I don't think President Macron, for example, in any way would want the Prime Minister not to try to use what relationships and influence he's got in Washington to make things better. He is doing the same thing. It is rather remarkable that even though post-Brexit we're outside the European Union, the political relationship with us and the French, and to some extent the Germans, though they're an unknown quantity at the moment, and Giorgia Meloni, a lot of the European partners, we are working extremely well. It's not either or, as we were saying before. It can be both and I think that has to be the right strategy for now.
Just to underscore, if I may, Peter's, it's not a zero-sum game point, and I think that's very much how the Prime Minister sees it. And I think if you think back to January 2022, before Putin invaded Ukraine, you had the US and the Brits reading the intelligence in one sense, and Europe reading it in a very different sense. And in the end, it was the UK-US interpretation that was the correct one. Putin did invade. I can't see that fundamentally changing, so that you have a different people on different sides of the aisle. But I do think tech is one reason why the relationship with America will continue regardless of the relationships between Downing Street and the future White House. America's approach to tech and AI is so advanced compared to Europe's. We as Britain are the third largest AI sector in the world after the US and China, and the Prime Minister and the government are going to want to keep that. So I think, if you like, life itself, those technological innovations will keep us moving with America, even as the Prime Minister rightly builds up the relationship with Europe.
It is now midday. I've got two more people who would like to ask questions. Can we prevail upon your goodwill to stay for a few more minutes? Thank you so much, Baroness Cousins.
Thank you. Thank you. Going back to Baroness Fraser's question about international organisations, now that Trump has come out of, or has stated he wants to come out of the World Health Organization, can we expect any further disengagement from other UN agencies? Or looking at the possibilities for more positive action within the UN, do you think there's any scope or appetite for encouraging US-UK pragmatic cooperation where they have overlapping penholder responsibilities at the Security Council? I'm thinking in particular of Sudan. And on a separate question, but the same theme, what do we know, if anything, about Trump's attitude to the BRICS countries? BRICS being the bloc that seems to be expanding rather rapidly at the moment, including a number of major Commonwealth countries.
I think we will still keep a very broad dialogue with the United States, government to government, but also NGOs to NGOs, about a whole range of multilateral issues, even when, if the US pull out of various agencies, because you can't discuss global health threats. You would want to discuss a reaction to a future pandemic with the United States, regardless of whether they were following WHO rules or not. And I think the nature of American programming, but we'll have to see where the review of American programs gets to, does allow them to still participate individually in different ventures. So I could see that happening on a range of issues currently dealt with by the UN agencies. For example, it may not, WHO may not be the last pull-out, but I do think you can keep the dialogue going. And in fact, in Trump 1, we were able to do that. On the BRICS countries, the Trump administration tends to deal with them individually rather than as a bloc. You'll know that President Trump has a very warm relationship with Modi, for example. And the relationship with India and the US is one that's only grown stronger under both administrations over the past few years. So I think they will continue to want to do that on a bilateral basis rather than try and engage with them as a bloc.
What about cooperation over the penholder responsibilities? I just wonder if that relationship can be leveraged when it comes to, a challenge like the war in Sudan, whether the US and the UK have got the potential to work together in a pragmatic way to actually achieve something.
Oh, definitely. There's no suggestion that I've seen that they would not want to cooperate with us, and indeed with France as the P3, the Western members of the Permanent Five, on a range of issues. And the Foreign Secretary has raised Sudan in particular with Secretary Rubio, and I think we'll be able to find a good way forward at the UN together.
Maybe just a final comment from any or all of you about, on the experience of Trump first presidency, how this one might go. I've heard it sort of said that we're almost at the end of the pre-scripted bit of his administration, where he's come in with 60 days of shock and awe, and there are some natural checks and balances as the administration goes through, the midterms arrive and all this, and we're at sort of peak chaos. And can you offer any sort of sense of abatement in this, where even within the back end of his presidency there may be an element of return to some normality because his power is somehow constrained? Or do you think he might be hell-bent on remaining unconstrained?
Maybe perhaps one comment. I think that it is worth remembering that, the United States is a federal country. So there are a lot of state authorities that may or may not see eye to eye with his programs and will put up resistance, I suspect, to some of them. I think there is the Congress, which so far has been accused anyway by the FT yesterday of missing in action. But his majorities in those two houses are very slim. And they do have the midterm elections coming along. It's not to say that Trump will lose them. But I think, Congress isn't necessarily going to accept everything he wants to do. And I'm sure it's worthwhile of people, not least on your committee, talking to your American counterparts in Congress. And as ambassador, I'm very keen that parliamentarians on both sides should remain really engaged with each other, because I think you can have an impact. And to the point that an awful lot of Americans don't know about Europe and really don't understand our point of view, you can make a real impact. I think there's a judiciary. That this is also, but I think above all, for me, what will count for Trump is what the markets decide. And we've touched on tariffs. But if the markets decide that they're really losing confidence in the Trump administration, then there will be, I think, there's the possibility of quite serious pushback by business, who are going to be worried about their profits and their shareholders and all sorts of other things. And the bond market in particular cannot be legislated or dictated to. So I think, will the Trump economic policy produce lower growth, higher inflation, disappointed people in Trump states? I think all of that is possible. But I think it's very, very hard to say. But at the moment, I think we're in a situation where, they are triumphant. They are carrying all before them. I mean, I'm not a politician. There are plenty of people in this room who are. Politics doesn't usually continue like that for very long. And I suspect that, things will start to get more difficult and go wrong. And that the Congress will find its voice, and so will business, and so will other players. And so I think imagining that at the moment this is how it's always going to be for the next 4 years is probably a mistake. I'm sure that's how they would like it to be, but whether it will actually turn out like that, I'm sceptical.
I wouldn't count on it. It would be lovely to believe we're at the peak. Maybe it's like peak oil a few years ago. I suspect quite a lot of it will continue because I think it's a different world order that he envisages, and I think it's a different way of doing politics nationally and internationally. I think you saw it again last night. Maybe it's a matter of degree, but this was another campaigning speech. It wasn't a governing speech. And the way in which the politics of campaigning are being transferred to America's international relations is, to me, one of the very important and very regrettable medium-term issues that we're facing, not least in relation to their attack on Europe and the use of powerful social media to push European politics in a particular direction. So I think it's a way of operating which I can't see him becoming a president who goes away at the weekend and spends his equivalent of time reading his box. It doesn't feel to me that it's going to be that sort of presidency. It's going to carry on being a presidency conducted in the public eye with policy being made on the hoof, though some of that may abate somewhat. On David's checks and balances, I think on the basis of the first 6 weeks, it really does depend on the courts. And we've got to hope that the courts, including the Supreme Court, offer that check, because for the time being, I think there's not very much in on the political side. And I think American business opinion is more muted, more concerned today than it was in 2017. In 2017, there was that sugar rush. There was the feeling that they were onto something, that the economy would do very well on the back of the tax cuts and other changes. I think today, because of tariffs, because of the hollowing out of the public space, which I think works at a general level of deregulation, but people worry about the detail. They worry about the funding, for example, for American universities and research. All these things, I think, make American business uncertain, probably supportive as much as they can be. But if you look at the markets, they've taken a tumble actually in the last few weeks.
I think you have to remember that President Trump has put his finger on something that the American people deeply feel. He won every swing state. He got, for the first time, a popular majority. It's been put to me by members of the Senate that part of the reason for this is because America has never faced, at least since 1814, an adversary with as strong an economy as America has. They've always had the upper hand economically. And now in China, they have a different sort of adversary, and they have not yet calibrated exactly how they want to deal with that. So some of what President Trump is doing, some of what is happening on the business and economic side is, I think, a response to that visceral feeling of things not being quite where America wants them to be. And then, as Nigel and David mentioned, some of the executive orders he has issued have gone straight into the courts or other parts of the checks and balances system. And we will need to see what's done about those, whether the courts decide them, whether they put them up through the system. But there is also a difference of philosophy, if you like, in the Trump administration about the powers of the president legally and constitutionally. And that is a debate that America will need to have with itself.
A couple of tiny things to add. The courts and the judges, yes, but some of them are, of course, Trump appointees. He's got a Republican majority in the Supreme Court that gave him essentially presidential immunity, more sweeping than most people would have expected. Generally, both in that respect and in the way in which he has filled the administration with appointees who are there for loyalty rather than necessarily competence, he was ready to win. Last time round he was surprised, and there were a whole lot of people who came from more traditional Reagan Republican backgrounds who served for a while, and some got spat out, some resigned, didn't work out, but they did operate to some extent as a constraint. I do not see much at the moment in the way of constraints other than, as Karen says, markets, and some of the Trump voters who might find that they're out of a job or out of an income and will eventually conclude that those are the result of his policies. As for the Congress, yes, I mean, the arithmetic that I've seen suggests that it's inconceivable that the Republicans would lose the Senate, but there's a good chance that they will lose the House. But that presupposes that the Democrats begin to get their act together, and so far they haven't done a brilliant job of that.
Well, thank you very much indeed for giving us a very sound base on which to proceed with our inquiry. We may need to come and ask you to speak to us again towards the end.
Probably not.
See how things have developed. Thank you so much.
Thank you.